If you've clicked on this video, then you probably know what E3 was, so I'm not really going to spend much time explaining what it is. I'm just going to give a brief description so that we're all up to date, and then we'll get into the interesting stuff. From 1995 through to 2021, the Entertainment Software Association, or the ESA, held a convention towards the start of every summer in which what seemed like the whole video game industry would come together to showcase what they've been cooking up for us, usually making a fool of themselves in the process. I remember getting incredibly excited for E3 every year since I found out that it was even a thing, which was around 2010 or so. But even though E3 isn't a thing anymore, it stopped after 2021, those same feelings of excitement do still bubble up a little bit every year. But like I said, E3 doesn't exist anymore. The last E3 was in 2021 and took place predominantly online as a result of
the coronavirus.
COVID-19.
So naturally things were pretty different for the show's final year. Even the show's name was changed from the Electronic Entertainment Expo to Electronic Entertainment Experience. Showcases were pre-recorded live streams instead of live press conferences with a packed audience, and there wasn't even a show floor for people to walk around and experience the games for themselves. All things considered though, this show wasn't terrible. There were terrible parts, it was still an E3. But you'd think the decline of an event so big would be a bit more disastrous. Nintendo and Microsoft both had solid showings, whilst Square Enix did everything they could to make people hate one of the best games of that year. And I guess Ubisoft were also there for some reason. However, the situation starts to become a lot clearer when you look at what was happening outside of the event itself. The last conventional E3 was in 2019, and even this show had signs of the end to come. Most notably, Sony decided that for the first time since the show began, they weren't going to attend. At the time, Sony's head of PlayStation pointed towards new avenues for reaching customers as one of the biggest reasons, likely referring to live streams, as it wasn't long afterwards that Sony began hosting their own Nintendo Direct style presentations. To them, E3 was no longer necessary, and the cost of attending just wasn't really worth it. Losing one of the show's biggest contributors was a huge deal. There were a lot of people who only really tuned in to Sony's press conferences and whatever they were showing, and even if we ignore the loss in viewership, it would also risk proving to other companies that there was really no need to attend E3, which was a huge risk to the convention as a whole. But the event still went ahead in 2019, and all in all, it was a pretty good showcase. It even gave us the legendary Keanu Reeves breathtaking memes. People were still enjoying the show perfectly fine from home, but the ESA knew they were going to have to make changes to the show if they wanted to keep going and not risk losing even more of their biggest partners. And a lot of these changes kind of rubbed people the wrong way, including one Geoff Keighley. You know him. You probably have mixed feelings about him. Maybe you hate him. But you can't deny that he is a significant figure in games media. He was also a significant figure of E3 for several years, often hosting post-show interviews with studio heads and executives. Through this, and his work on various other gaming-focused TV shows over the past 20-odd years, Geoff has amassed a lot of industry influence that made it possible for him to begin organising the Game Awards since 2014. So Geoff Keighley is no stranger to organising big events within the games industry, especially those with a focus on reveals and announcements. He even set up a whole company to do just that. So whilst there was no immediate concern, the ESA probably weren't very happy when he announced that he wouldn't be returning for E3 in 2020. As far as I've been able to find, Geoff never gave a reason as to why he decided to drop out, only ever stating that it was a number of reasons. though I have a strong guess as to what one of those reasons might be. In August of 2019, it was discovered that the personal details of over 2,000 journalists, content creators and developers were freely available to download from the official E3 website. This included names, email addresses, home addresses, phone numbers, and they were just straight up doxed. Several people on the list were harassed because of this, many of whom had already been subject to hate campaigns as part of Gamergate just a few years prior. With this, the ESA had lost the trust of a lot of industry professionals, and rightfully so. Signing up to E3 had just been declared a risk to your safety. Between this and how easy it had become to get information into the world through the internet, studios, journalists and content creators alike were seeing E3 as less of an opportunity and more of a liability. E3 ended up being cancelled in 2020 as a result of
the COVID-19,
which meant that June was now looking a lot quieter than usual. The problem though is a lot of companies, especially smaller studios, still relied on that spotlight that E3 would give them to raise awareness of their games, and that spotlight was especially needed with the launch of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series consoles at the end of the year. Now, Sony and Microsoft had all the resources they needed to just make their own presentations. Sony had already been doing it for a year. But most smaller studios simply don't have those resources. And that's where Geoff Keighley saw an opportunity. Geoff would begin organising Summer Game Fest, an all-summer-long showcase of what the whole industry was working on. Like E3, but longer. And also, not like E3. Whilst E3 felt like a hard and fast barrage of announcements and reveals, Summer Game Fest felt like it gave the games being shown off a bit more time to breathe and show themselves in more detail. There were still those major presentations, but they were spread out over a much longer time span. The first Summer Game Fest being several months long was definitely a major benefit at the time. It meant that studios had more time to plan and put stuff together, whereas studios who already had most of their stuff ready didn't have to wait around to get a spotlight on what they'd already prepared. And that spotlight is what's most important here. The main reason to go to E3 was to shine a spotlight on your work. Summer Game Fest was doing that, but without asking developers to spend millions on a stage, booth, and organising their whole presentation. Just put together a trailer, maybe book an interview slot, possibly put out a demo on Steam, and you were golden. Geoff and his team ensured that developers and publishers still had a stage that people would watch. It was significantly less work for about the same results. Of course, the whole event would never have happened if not for Geoff's plethora of industry connections. He's someone whom developers, executives, and journalists alike all seem to trust. Yes, he's no stranger to controversy, but his controversies are nowhere near the scale of E3 just straight up doxing people. In fact, a lot of his controversies tend to come more from how the general public perceives him, but we'll get into that a bit more later. For now, let's take a look at how Summer Game Fest has evolved over the years. 2021 is the only year where Summer Game Fest and E3 went head to head. This time the event only lasted for a little over a month, which I think was for the best this year. When it's spread out over the whole of summer, you begin to lose momentum and people stop paying attention. It was a smart move that still allowed enough time for studios of all sizes to get a showcase. What's notable about 2021 though was that this was the first time that they would kick off the event with a major showcase, much like companies would do for E3 every year. Not being bound to a single publisher means that the expectations for these showcases can be almost limitless. But the variety also means that a lot of games will show up that you just won't care about. Not because they're bad, which they sometimes are, but because it's just not for you. Yeah, you get the long-awaited reveal of Elden Ring gameplay or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but you also had to sit through 5 or 10 minutes of Genshin Impact trailers. This was a risk with publisher-specific E3 showcases as well, but those audiences were a lot less broad, which meant the situation wasn't as pronounced as it is here. And I use the word situation because it isn't technically a problem. Variety is a good thing. People like all sorts of games, and even most of the best showcases will typically have 1 or 2 things that just aren't your cup of tea for whatever reason. But trying to showcase so much can also be a bit of a double-edged sword. There will be thousands of people who watch the entire 2-3 hour show who will only see 1, maybe 2 games that they're interested in. Even if every game there is good, their taste might mean that for them, the show comes across as meaningless, pointless, and boring, even though that isn't necessarily the case. The problems with public perception don't stop here, though. Geoff's shows are filled with advertisements. Like, yes, the shows exist for the main purpose of advertising new games, that's been the case for every year of E3. But it's not just games. It's shit like DoorDash, Amazon Prime, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, fucking Chick Hydrobot. Look, I know Chick Hydrobot was at the Game Awards and not Summer Game Fest. I just need more people to remember that Chick Hydrobot happened. The way that Geoff Keighley's showcases are structured means that they're a lot more egregious and upfront about their advertising. But why is that? The obvious answer is greed, but that is an oversimplification, and whilst I do think that it's a factor, I don't think that it's the only one. Most E3 presentations were set up by the publishers themselves, so any money put into their show would typically be made back when it came time to sell what they were showing off. But Geoff doesn't make money from these games coming out. He and his company are a separate entity who need to make their own money to keep going. This is in part why slots at these showcases can cost so much money, and also why the shows are so stacked with advertisements for all sorts of things. At E3, presentations were a part of the marketing to eventually sell the product. At Summer Game Fest, the presentation is the product. This isn't to say that E3 didn't have its share of terrible advertisements. Xbox would do this thing where they'd bring a stupidly expensive car on stage whenever there was a new Forza game. E3 was also no stranger to having random celebrities show up who had no idea where they were or what they were doing. But because the show itself is what makes the money, it doesn't just feel embarrassing and out of touch now. It also feels like an insult to the people watching. Another situation altogether, which E3 never really tackled, however, was industry drama. In the wake of the state of California's lawsuit against Activision Blizzard for widespread sexual misconduct throughout the entire company, Geoff used the stage at the Game Awards to just vaguely say that harassment is bad. He didn't name anyone, it was a soft and bland statement that everyone would publicly agree with. Same again when he made a broad sweeping statement about industry layoffs. He didn't call out any studios in particular. Yet in 2015 he was more than willing to publicly call out Konami during the Game Awards livestream for not letting AI sellout Hideo Kojima attend, despite his game being nominated for Game of the Year. Geoff Keighley seems to have no issue with calling out a company's shitty behaviour when it affects him or someone close to him, but when companies are actively ruining lots of people's lives, they don't get the same naming and shaming. They barely get any shaming. Geoff still takes their money and puts their games on show. He's put himself in a position where he needs their money to keep going, so if he takes a meaningful stand against anything, then he risks losing that money. Geoff Keighley is in such a unique position, such a unique platform to call this stuff out, and he's proven that he will. He just hasn't proven that he'll take a meaningful stand against it, and that makes all of these statements just feel pointless and hollow and meaningless. Nobody at E3 was ever going to do anything like this. Year after year, the show would essentially act like everything was sunshine and rainbows in the games industry, despite that being far from the truth. It was an out-of-touch celebration of marketing that happened to be entertaining for a mixture of right and wrong reasons, but eventually it just couldn't find a reason to continue existing. The people putting on the show were out of touch with what viewers cared about, and the people organising it were out of touch with what the game studios cared about. Geoff Keighley has proven that he can listen to feedback. His statements against widespread industry practices came after a lot of pressure was put on him to address those things. And every Game Awards presentation makes changes that feel like something of an overcorrection to the things people complained about the year prior. He's proven that he listens. He's proven that he cares. He just hasn't proven why that matters.
DoorDash has your back. You can get a free burrito when you order from Taco Bell.
E3's death was inevitable whether Geoff Keighley started Summer Game Fest or not. Developers, journalists, influencers and executives had all lost a lot of faith in the ESA, and quite rightfully so. You add that into the fact that it was now just so easy to put together a pre-recorded video and make your announcements online with a huge platform instantly at your fingertips, and there wasn't really much of a point to E3 existing anymore. And for the companies without a relatively large platform, or if they just wanted a bit more attention on their game, Geoff offered a spotlight which was relatively safe, and for a fraction of the cost, effort and resources that E3 required. And the best part is, Geoff isn't going to stand up to them. Not when they abuse their employees, not when they lay off their staff, or when they engage in harmful business practices, and not even when they're just kind of evil. He'll act like he's taking a stand, but only when he feels the public pressure to do so, and Geoff is in touch enough with the public to know when there's pressure to do so. Honestly, I think Geoff does care about the industry, but how much he cares is routinely outweighed by how much he needs the money from all of the companies doing the evil things. And as long as he continues to be useful, that isn't going to change. So whilst I don't think that Geoff Keighley is responsible for the death of E3, for better or worse, he is the reason it's never coming back.